let's talk about the U.S. intelligence assessment that has come out, that has been published by the Washington Post. We don't know who the intel officials are. They're anonymous intel officials, an anonymous report from them that the U.S. intelligence community, U.S. intelligence, is indicating that Ukraine will fail to meet its offensive goals in its counteroffensive in the south. Now, what some people are, I think, assuming what this immediately means is that no goals have been achieved, where it seems to mostly be focused on cutting off the Russian land bridge. The assessment doesn't say that nothing has been achieved. For example, there has been a extreme jump in the amount of Russian counter battery fire that has been eliminated. There are counter batteries being struck. There have been some villages liberated. But when it comes to what the original assessment of what the United States expected, or not expected necessarily, but wanted to see out of this counteroffensive, and what the Ukrainians wanted to see out of this counteroffensive, they have not been able to meet those goals. And they're not on track to meet those goals. Now, this report doesn't completely say that the offensive is over and that it's lost. I think some people are doomering too hard because they don't read the whole report. They just read the headline. It does go on to say that the intel community still believes that it is possible that in this month or the next month, basically until, winter really sets in, that a breakthrough could happen if they concentrate their forces on one area, breakthrough, or the Russian line snaps because it's been worn down too thin, and they could flood in troops into that hole. But that so far they are not on track to do that. Let's read a little bit of the article and then we can talk about it, because I want to talk about the assessment, and I also want to talk about how did we possibly get into the situation. Of course, I'm not a hardcore military expert. I'm a journalist on the ground, so I can only give you the on-the-ground perspective and not a super expert military perspective, unless I've been told by other people on the ground who are military experts, their assessments. So let's break down what happened, and then let's talk about why we think it happened. The U.S. intelligence community assesses that Ukraine's counteroffensive will fail to reach the key English is a terrible language. It butchers me so brutally. The southeastern city of Mariupol. People familiar with the classified forecast told the Washington Post a finding that, should it prove correct, would mean Kiev won't fulfill its principal objective of severing Russia's land bridge to Crimea in this year's push. The grim assessment is based on Russia's brutal proficiency in defending occupied territory through a phalanx of minefields and trenches, and is likely to prompt finger-pointing inside Kiev and Western capitals about why a counteroffensive that saw tens of billions of dollars of Western weapons and military equipment fell short of its goals. Ukraine's forces, which are pushing towards Mariupol from the town of Robotny, more than 50 miles away, will remain several miles outside of the city, U.S. officials said. U.S., Western, and Ukrainian government officials interviewed for this report spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive military operations. They are closer to the city. In fact, I saw like something that was published a few days ago talking about how they were within miles of major locations, but there's still so many defenses between them and these locations that there's so much that you have to get through. Where there's not like a tremendous amount of land now between Ukrainian forces in these major cities, but these fields have been filled with trenches that are full of Russians, anti-tank traps like the Dragon's Teeth and anti-tank ditches. They've got anti-tank weapons in these trenches. There's multiple layers of it. There's 3 lines of defenses. And one of the big things, and this is something I believe the article talks about later on, and this is something that I'm consistently hearing from people who are both participating in the counteroffensive and from people who are just serving anywhere on the front line for the Ukrainian armed forces, is that Russian air power is severely undermining their efforts to push forward. If you look at the American operation during the Gulf War, very effective, very fast, we obliterated the Iraqi army, right? The idea of conducting that operation without air power would be crazy. Absolutely crazy. Or under the idea that the Iraqis would actually have a more powerful fleet of aircraft. That'd be wild. And the casualties we would have taken would have been much higher. The speed of the operation would have been much slower. The casualties taken for the Iraqis, I mean, it probably would have been lower significantly. That probably the highway of hell probably wouldn't have happened. The army wouldn't have been as obliterated as much as it was. But even though we don't expect this to be the standard for the American armed forces, for us to conduct these type of operations without air superiority, that is what we're expecting of the Ukrainians, because they don't have air superiority and they don't have the aircraft in order to gain air superiority. And they're not going to get F-16s by the end of the year. Now, there is a new report that just came out, I believe actually earlier today, that the United States has now approved F-16 fighter jets to be sent to Ukraine from Denmark and from the Netherlands after they have finished training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. But they're still not going to send it to them by the end of the year. And if I'm being completely honest with you, they probably shouldn't send these F-16s to Ukraine by the end of the year. Not because they don't want the Ukrainians to have the F-16s, but until these pilots, and this is something Mark Milley said as well, until these pilots are trained on the F-16s, having them in Ukraine just makes them another target for the Russians. If nobody can pilot them, all you're doing is putting an expensive Western aircraft in a Ukrainian airport just to sit there and do nothing, when you could have it in a Western military base sitting there until the Ukrainian is trained to the best of his ability, and then you can transfer it so it could actually, even though it's going to be in danger now, it's being used, so it's not pointlessly in danger. So we're not going to have the type of air power that's going to be necessary to counter the Russian aircraft. Now, some people will say, okay, but what about the shoulder-mounted munitions? We all saw those Stingers. We all saw early on when all the Ukrainian units were shooting down Russian helicopters. In fact, we just had a video of a Russian helicopter getting shot down just yesterday. And a Russian MiG, I think, getting shot down very recently. It even made the Russians, it was so embarrassing for the Russians, they had to fake their own shooting down of a MiG. But they did it very poorly, so it was very easily called out by the OPSEC community. So why isn't that enough to deal with Russian air power? And it's because Russian air power will just simply stay out of range. What'll happen is if the shoulder-mounted munition has a range of, say, like 8 kilometers, then the helicopter will stay around 8.5 kilometers out of range and then lob rockets at your position. And even if it won't be terribly accurate because they're not super close to you, that means they get to lob rockets at you and you can't shoot them down. And so shooting down these aircraft is a science of trying to either get in, like get into an area where they don't know you're close enough, or surprise them where they're traveling through an area they don't know where you are and you got to shoot it down. But they're trying to stay at a range far away enough so they can stay out of those type of shoulder-mounted munitions. So that's why they're not able just to shoot them all down, because the Russians know they have them. The Russians engage with a problem, and even if the Russians haven't managed the war in the best way, if they engage a problem, eventually they're going to correct for it. Eventually, some commander is going to give some order to try to correct for their aircraft getting shot down, because that's one of the few benefits that they have over the Ukrainians is their air force. I mean, they have other benefits, of course, like population size and stuff, but that's one of their most useful benefits. And so I think that's probably one of the major contributing factors, or the most, one of the most, if we're, the other one, of course, being the defensive positions, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I think that's probably one of the most important factors that have slowed down the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Let's read a little bit more of the article, and then we can talk about the other elements, because the article gets into other parts I want to talk about. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence declined to comment. Mariupol is critical to Ukraine's counteroffensive because it is considered the gateway to Crimea. The city is at the intersection of 2 important highways and railroad lines that allows Russia to move military personnel and equipment from the peninsula to other occupied territories in southern Ukraine. Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in early June, hoping to replicate its stunning success in last fall's push through the Kharkiv region. But in the first week of fighting, Ukraine incurred major casualties against Russia's well-prepared defenses, despite having a range of newly acquired Western equipment, including U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles, German-made Leopard 2 tanks, and specialized mine-clearing vehicles. Okay, so why is it that the Kharkiv counteroffensive was so successful so quickly? I mean, people forget, the Kharkiv counteroffensive lasted 3.5 weeks, and they liberated Kupiansk and pushed the Russians completely out of the Kharkiv Oblast. So why was it that was so successful in comparison to this operation? Well, it's a few factors, but the first factor is that the Russian line around Kharkiv was incredibly thin. They were not expecting a counterattack, and they left it understaffed, and they put personnel in other places in the country, including Kherson and Zaporozhye and other areas in Donetsk and Luhansk, which meant that the Kharkiv Oblast was understaffed. And the soldiers that were there were not of necessarily the best quality. There were good soldiers there as well, good Russian soldiers there as well. I mean, as in, like, good fighting soldiers. But they weren't of the highest quality. So that's one factor. The line was extremely thin, and if it's a thin front line with not a lot of defensive positions, then it was going to be easier to break through. And they don't have a lot of troops in the area to redeploy quickly, then you have a disaster on your hands for the Russians. And that's what the Ukrainians capitalized on. And they were really, really fast, even to the point where it was hard to communicate with the different units and know where everyone was at any particular time, because they were moving so fast and getting so little rest and pushing and liberating villages. They liberated over 500 settlements during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. So I would say that that's the first element. The second element is they knew where they were coming. In Zaporozhye, we all knew that they were going to attack Zaporozhye. I mean, we didn't know for sure they were going to attack Zaporozhye, but we all knew they were probably going to attack Zaporozhye. In the lead up to the Kharkiv counteroffensive, everybody's direction was in Kherson, and for the Kherson counteroffensive, it made the most sense attacking Kherson, because there was the river dividing the city of Kherson for the rest of the Russian positions. That would strain Russian logistics. It made the most sense for that to be the next target to attack. And so the Russians redeployed all their troops over there and were concentrating there. So it was an unexpected attack. This, in Zaporozhye, unbelievably expected. This attack on Zaporozhye couldn't have been more expected. Why do you think there's all these tank traps? Why do you think there's all the dragon's teeth? Why do you think that all these trenches and encampments and all these different positions have been built up? Why do you think they pre-calculated the artillery? I mean, they prepared these. Why do you think they laid out? And this is the big factor that was underestimated by both the United States and the Ukrainians, and I guess not spotted by the Ukrainians until after they started trying to do these armored pushes and started the counteroffensive, was just how many mines were out there. And I said this months ago, before the counteroffensive went underway. I said this 3 or 4 months ago. One of the major factors that the world is not paying attention to is the demining effort in Ukraine. Not only when it comes to military sappers, as is the case here, and the demining equipment for those military sappers, but also when it comes to the humanitarian angle, the environmental and CESU, that's emergency services that work in demining, the ones that, remove the mines from power lines so they can restore power to local villages, try to clear butterfly mines from civilian areas, try to get TM62 mines out of farm fields, even though their resources are so stranded or so strained that a lot of farmers, they kind of just have to tell, maybe next year we don't have the resources for it. But there's been so little investment in demining, even though the environmental minister of Ukraine says that Ukraine is the most mined country in the world, as in 1/3 of the country is covered in mines. And after living a month with demining crews and filming with them and talking to them about the issues that they face, yeah, they are facing not only a resource shortage, but probably a staffing shortage, with a lot of the demining crew members for both CESU and probably even military sappers. But I have less experience with military sappers. I've only ever interviewed 2 military sappers. They have a problem with inexperience as well, because these CESU workers are only getting like a month to train. That's a lot less than what American American sappers, but American deminers and demining crews get, or demining crews in most countries get. But the war has made them have to go through a crash course very quickly to try to get these skills. And so just not been enough investment. Demining vehicles, that's another element. They just don't have enough demining vehicles to deal with these minefields, both in civilian areas and in military areas. I mean, finally, I think the Kharkiv Oblast they've gotten a factory certified to produce about, I think, 2 demining vehicles a month, because they only have 20, I think, in Ukraine. So that is an improvement, but still they need so much more. And it's not even something that I'm just saying, right? This is something that I know that Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he brought this up too, after we confirmed cluster munition shipments. I think this is something I'm going to be pushing till I am done talking about this war, because the war is over. And even after the war, I'm going to be talking about it, because this is going to be an issue until I'm dead in Ukraine. 80 to 100 years, they're going to be removing these mines. And those are old estimates I got months ago, if the war was ending then. This investment is unbelievably important. And I think the fact that we've given them cluster munitions, which has seemed to have helped them on the battlefield, there's a lot of reports coming to those cluster munitions have helped them capture some of the villages they have captured during these counteroffensives. We should use that as an opportunity to announce much more investments into demining. I know we've done some, but I think we need to do much much more. I think we've only scratched the surface. Okay, let's continue. Joint war games conducted by the United States, British, and Ukrainian militaries anticipated such losses, but envisioned Kiev accepting the casualties as the cost of piercing through Russia's main defensive line. But Ukraine chose to stem the losses on the battlefield and switched to a tactic relying on smaller units to push forward across different areas of the front. This resulted in Ukraine making incremental gains in different pockets over the summer. It meant less casualties for the Ukrainians. It meant they were concentrating a lot more on taking out Russian counter-battery fire, which I don't think this article talked too much about. But it also meant that they were not going to one big push, boom, they've broken through the line. It would mean they would have to wear the line down slowly and then break through it, which of course takes more time, is going to be a lot slower, and is not going to come with such boom, you've broken through the front line, shocking victory. Kiev has recently dedicated more reserves to the front, including Striker and Challenger units, but has yet to break through the Russia's main defense line. The path to Mariupol is an extremely challenging one, and even recapturing closer cities such as Tokmak will become difficult, said Rob Lee, a military analyst with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Russia has 3 main defensive lines there and then fortified cities after that, he said. It's not just a question about whether Ukraine can breach 1 or 2 of them, but can they breach all 3 of them and have enough forces available after trying to taking attrition to achieve something more significant, like taking one of the cities beyond that. Okay, so I think we've gotten most of the article that is important read. Is there anything else here that there's one last thing I wanted to talk about before I give my general conclusions. Okay, let's read a little bit more then. I can't find it, but I'll find it if I just read more. I had said a couple of months ago that this offensive was going to be long, it was going to be bloody, it was going to be slow. And that's exactly what it is. Long, bloody, and slow. And it's a very, very difficult fight. While not achieving its objectives, he noted, and this is important, and I do want to talk about this for a moment, he noted Kiev's successes in degrading Russian forces. The Russians are in pretty rough shape, he said. They've suffered a huge amount of casualties. The morale is not great. U.S. officials said the Pentagon recommended multiple times that Ukraine concentrate a large mass of forces on a single breakthrough point, though the Ukrainians opted for a different strategy. They said it was Kiev's call to make, given the profound sacrifice Ukrainian troops are making on the battlefield, which is absolutely true. But about this statement right here, the way the counteroffensive success is being measured, and this makes sense because this is how they were talking about it when talking about the counteroffensive, seems to largely be in what villages are controlled and what colors the map are made. You know, how much territory is liberated, how many villages are captured, how many cities are captured. Very little attention and detail is given in reporting on this counteroffensive to how much damage is being done to either side. As in how many soldiers are dying, how many tanks are exploding. The most you'll see every once in a while is a few burnt out vehicles. And they'll say, oh, look at this one snapshot of burnt out vehicles. You don't see them trying to, okay, let's look at all the open source intel and gather what we have and see how many vehicles were destroyed. Or this is something I'd be really interested in mainstream media covering more, because this is a resource that is readily available. And if I can access it, I know they can access it, looking at Russian military telegrams. One of the few ways we can get any honesty from the Russian side, and still it's a lot of times dipped in a lot of lies, and it's not 100% honest, and it comes from a pretty warped perspective, but Russian military telegram can give you some pretty brutal truths that the Russian military establishment don't want you to know. That's why Igor Girkin got arrested in the first place. Igor Girkin wouldn't have gotten arrested if he wasn't saying things that didn't make the Russian government made the Russian government look good. He was saying things that exposed the Russian government for mismanaging the war and made them look bad, as he was doomering about the potential of this counteroffensive to be successful and for the Ukrainians to build upon other successes as well. And so I wish that mainstream media talked more about the massive increase of counter or battery fire being destroyed, Russian artillery being destroyed, and talking about those Russian military telegrams and how they're viewing the war and how much damage it's done to the Russian logistics and how much damage it's done to Russian units. Because I think that if we measured this counteroffensive in more ways than one, and that is just how much territory is controlled, I think it would mean that I would be less doomery and a lot more people would be less doomery about the results of the counteroffensive. Because if I was able to say, hey, you know what? We didn't capture all of these cities, but we doubled and or tripled the amount of Russian artillery batteries we took out. I mean, that's still not a success in our operation, but that doesn't mean we didn't achieve anything. But I haven't seen any coverage of that by mainstream media, and I don't even see much coverage of that from alt media either. I remember hearing the report about a 200%, it was a 100% increase in the amount of Russian counter battery fire getting destroyed, and even if it was a 50% increase, that would be significant. But if it's anywhere close to that, that is extremely significant. But that's not what's talked about, because that isn't how people talked about the counteroffensive going into it. They didn't say, let's get ready for a slow attritional struggle, even though that was what was most likely. U.S. officials, I already read this. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba on Thursday acknowledged the slow pace of Ukraine's counteroffensive, but said Kiev would not stop fighting until all of its land is retaken. We don't care how long it takes, he told the news agency, Agence Free Press. Okay, so AFP. I always forget that's its actual full title. It's a French outlet. He encouraged critics of the offensive to go out. He encouraged critics of the offensive to go and join the Foreign Legion if they wanted faster results. It's easy to say they want everything to be faster when you're not there, he said. Ukrainian officials have said privately that timing depends on how quickly forces can penetrate minefields, a difficult process that has strained the military mine-clearing resources across a wide swath of territory. Analysts say the challenges Ukraine has faced are multifaceted, but nearly all agree that Russia surpassed expectations when it comes to the proficiency in defending occupied territory. The most deterministic factor of how this offensive has gone thus far is the quality of Russian defenses, said Lee, noting Russian use of trenches, mines, and aviation. They had a lot of time and they prepared them very well and made it very difficult for Ukraine to advance. Again, the main thing that I'm hearing complaints about from soldiers is the minefields. It's always been the minefields, and it's still the minefields. It's always the minefields. Soldiers still get killed overwhelmingly by artillery, but when you're talking about doing any kind of concentrated armored offensive, you can't do that through a minefield where it's like a single plot of farmland is going to have like 150 anti-tank mines in it. And I'm not exaggerating when I say 150 anti-tank mines in it. When I was in the Kharkiv Oblast, in territory that was liberated months earlier, with demining crews going to these farmlands, and we would take these drones and we would fly them over the farmlands, try to identify the mines. We'd get massive amounts of mines in this farmland because they were preparing for a counteroffensive in Kharkiv, trying to stop it. But obviously they failed. And so if you take that, though, and you extend that across the entirety of the Zaporozhye front line, that type of concentration of mines, and you give them 10 months to prepare, well, golly gee, yeah, it's going to be pretty shitty conditions, huh? And that's actually a critique I've been hearing from the ground here, from Ukrainian soldiers and from others, is that, yeah, it is true that the counteroffensive is going pretty slowly, but what do you expect if we don't have air power? What do you expect if we don't have parity when it comes to like firepower in our artillery and our missiles? What do you expect when you're not giving us things like ATACMS that could further strain their logistics? What do you expect when you slow walk the tank shipments and you slow walk the shipments of all the other munitions that Ukraine desperately needs? That was something I was constantly hearing, that if they got this equipment months earlier and they got their units trained on them much earlier and they could have gotten started in the offensive much earlier, then maybe there wouldn't be these many mines, there probably wouldn't be these many defensive positions, and it would be probably easier to capture these villages. But this is a bunch of shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? Shoulda, woulda, coulda. All we can do is look towards the future. And when it comes to these minefields, and I'm going to strain this again, I already said this once in this video, but I want to say it again, we got to invest heavily into demining equipment, and there is a universality in the value in us providing this demining equipment. What do I mean by that? It is not only helpful now, it'll be helpful 70 years from now, it'll be helpful 80 to probably 90 to 100 years from now. Whatever demining equipment we give Ukraine, it's not like it's going to be like, we wasted it, we gave them too much. There's no such thing as too much demining equipment for a country that could possibly be the most mined country in the world, if you listen to its environmental minister, and is going to be dealing with this issue for the next 80 to 100 years. No matter what, the United States has said that Ukraine is our determined ally, that we're going to be determined allies with Ukraine no matter how this goes, that we're going to have their back. And having their back is going to be trying to help them with this issue, especially if we're providing them cluster munitions that is going to partially add to that issue. Anyway, let's continue. Let's finish this article because I want to make sure we do one more segment before we do the stuff later with Mikado. The Ukrainians have for months poured tremendous resources into Bakhmut, including soldiers, ammunition, and time, but they have lost control of the city and have made only modest gains in capturing territory around it. And while the close-in trench-line fighting is different in Bakhmut from the problems of mines in the south, the focus has left some in Biden's administration concerned that overcommitting in the east may have eroded the potency of the counteroffensive in the south. Now, I don't know how much I buy this, and there seems to be not a tremendous amount of evidence of this provided in the article. But I mean, it is something that they're speculating around. Something I want to add, number one, if the Ukrainians didn't make the stand at Bakhmut, they would have to make the stand somewhere else. The Russians didn't just want to capture Bakhmut because it was a symbolic, it became a symbolic representation of the war and Ukrainian resistance, because how long this very small city held out, 9 to 10 months, when it was expected to only last a few weeks. Putting that aside, it's still a stepping stone that they need to try to take the rest of the Donbass, which the Russians still want to do. There's a reason why they've gathered 100,000 soldiers in Kharkiv, 900 tanks in Kharkiv, 555 artillery batteries in Kharkiv. They gathered those supplies because they want to continue the push, and they are continuing the push. I'm being told by my I don't want to say my boys over there. I don't know what I should refer to them. They're not my correspondents. They're just people I message, hey, how you doing, man? How's it going? Oh, how's the wife, kids, yada yada. Yeah, it's been pretty shit here. So I don't know what to call them. But my buddies out there are telling me that they're getting shelled sometimes 12, 13, 14, 15 times a day. That's why I didn't get to do an artillery embed out there. So they do still want to push to take the rest of the Donbass. And so if it wasn't at Bakhmut, it could be at Slovansk, or it'd be at Kramatorsk, or it'd be at some other location or other city that would be reduced to rubble. And so you need to understand that type of calculation that Ukrainians are making. Where, okay, you pull back from Bakhmut, Russians take Bakhmut, but if they don't expend all their resources taking that, then those shells are going to hit other cities. It's going to hit Kramatorsk. It's going to hit Slovansk. It's going to hit these cities with larger populations and going to destroy not only Bakhmut and raise that to the ground, but then other cities as well. So you're trying to isolate these cities from destruction. There's also strategic reasons to do that, but I want to throw that out there, that you're asking commanders to make the decision to bring the front line, in many instances, when we're talking about Eastern Ukraine, to their hometowns and to their cities. And so they are going to, in a lot of cases, they're going to fight tooth and nail for every piece of land because they want to isolate those communities from the violence. And that's just one element of it that I don't think is covered enough, so I just wanted to mention it. There's other strategic reasons for it, of course. The Russians did lose a lot of soldiers attacking Bakhmut. Wagner lost a lot of people attacking Bakhmut, lost a lot of equipment attacking Bakhmut. And when you look at the amount of territory that they gained for the amount of resources that they expended, it was not that strategically beneficial for the Russians. And they didn't take, and that was the culmination of the winter counteroffensive, was just the capturing of Bakhmut. Now, that's not saying, just Bakhmut, but when you think about what the Russians wanted to achieve, just Bakhmut is very disappointing for them. Definitely at the price that they paid to take it. Okay, we're almost done with the article. The new intelligence assessment aligns with a secret U.S. forecast from February, indicating that shortfalls in equipment and force strength may mean that the counteroffensive will fall well short of Ukraine's goal to sever the land bridge to Crimea by August. The assessment, detailed in a classified document leak onto the social media app Discord, identified Mariupol and Mariupol as the objectives to deny Russian overland access to Crimea. U.S. officials said Washington was still open to Kiev, surprising skeptics and overcoming the odds. One defense official, and this is important, they're saying that it can still happen. So, and I remember the Washington Post produced an article before the Kherson counteroffensive, and Obviously, this is different because this is coming from U.S. intel reports, but I do want to throw this out there, that they produced an article saying, like, no sign of the counteroffensive, like a week before the Kherson counteroffensive made massive gains and then would push on to liberate, you know, the city of Kherson. So the idea of something like that happening isn't completely out of the picture, even if the odds are against it right now. Ukraine could buck historical norms and continue the counteroffensive through the winter, when everything, including keeping soldiers warm and stocked with food and ammunition boxes, becomes much more difficult. But that would rely on several important factors, such as the amount of rest troops need after a hard fighting season. It would also depend on how much specialized equipment and cold weather clothing they have on hand, the defense official said. But Moscow may also outperform during winter military operations. Okay, so let's drop some conclusions. First off, the article is not saying that it's failed, it's done, we know that for sure. That's not what the article's saying. What the article's saying is that U.S. intelligence is suggesting that the original goal of cutting off the Russian land bridge is most likely, not guaranteed, but most likely not going to happen. I saw some people saying, okay, so this proves it's over. That is not the case. Even if they don't cut off the land bridge, if they were to get closer to these major locations, these major cities that they need to capture, like Mariupol, that could still be an achievement. That's still something that they are achieving, getting closer, because the closer they get, the more they can hammer these positions, the more they have a launching pad later they can build upon, but it's still not what they originally wanted. So what does this mean? I have seen some people trying to say that this shows that the Ukrainians are out of it. Number one, the counteroffensive isn't over, so you can't say that. Number two, these positions in Zaporozhye were tremendously well defended, and the Ukrainians were expected to launch a counteroffensive into these positions without air superiority, without F-16s, without long-range missiles that the United States has yet to provide them. They do have Storm Shadows, they do have some long-range missiles, but more long-range missiles they've been requesting, and with a slow walking the shipments. Which is true. We did slow walk a lot of the shipments, meaning that they gave the Russians more and more time to build up, which is true. Now, that isn't to remove any culpability from Ukrainian commanders, because I have seen some people hesitant to put any culpability at all onto local Ukrainian commanders. For example, a lot of the reason why I think that the breaking through the front line, like Kharkiv, didn't work is because these positions are obviously built up better. And if they underestimated how many mines were in these minefields, ultimately that would be on the Ukrainians to identify that problem. They're the ones with soldiers in the field. They're the ones with sappers in the field. They're the ones with the people out there that can identify that problem firsthand, either by using the methods that I know a lot of people have been using recently, which is using thermal drones with that can capture and detect heat. And once it gets a little cooler, they see the mines, which usually hold on to heat for longer periods of time, and they can identify it that way. They can do it a more traditional, like hands-on way. I mean, they no matter what, they didn't identify how bad the problem was. And so if we don't know how bad the problem is, it's hard to prepare for it or to be ready for it if you didn't know that, right? And so that ultimately does fall on the local Ukrainian commanders. But that doesn't remove, but ultimately I talk to mostly an American audience, so I want to pressure the American audience to say, slow walking aid, if the purpose of the Biden administration is to give Ukraine the tools to win, is not a winning strategy when the Russians are given time to build up. Launching armored counteroffensives into pre-prepared positions without air superiority, or at least some form of relative air parity, or something to counter these helicopters and Russian aircraft more effectively, is going to be unbelievably difficult. And we would not expect our soldiers to launch an operation like that in similar circumstances. Ultimately, though, I'm not going to play the, like, this is the person, this is their fault, this is his fault, this commander, that commander, this politician. That's not the game to play. The question is, where do we go from here? Because I've seen some people saying this proves that the war is over, that it's all done for. Obviously, that isn't the case. right? The Ukrainians successfully pushed the Russians back from Kiev. The Ukrainians successfully engaged in the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives, liberating tons of territory, right? The Ukrainians have shown that they can get success on the battlefield, that is possible. This failed offensive does not prove that now the tide has turned and now they cannot launch any more offensives in the future. Ukraine has already had more shipments promised to them. They haven't run out of gear in the sense that, oh, they've used up all their stockpiles, they're not going to get anything else. They launched this offensive with the knowledge, and I know Pirun released a video where he talked about this months ago before the counteroffensive was really underway. It was when I was filming with Demining Crews, and I thought this was a really good point. They launched this offensive with much equipment dedicated to Ukraine, but still not delivered to Ukraine, knowing that it would probably be delivered to them into winter or the early months of next year, not being able to be used in this counteroffensive because it wouldn't be here in time. Example, the Abrams tanks. None of the Abrams tanks, none of the 31 Abrams tanks that we provided Ukraine has been used in combat because they're still training them on them and still preparing them on them. The F-16s, we're not even going to see them here in the country this year. It's just they're not going to be trained on them in time. That's going to be something that we'd probably see not even early next year, late next year. When it comes to increased artillery production, the United States, as of last year, was producing about 24,000 artillery shells. As of next year, it's going to be 80,000 artillery shells for M77 howitzers. So that's going to be something that can help. But what we need to do moving forward is we need to have a mentality of give them the tools necessary for victory in every circumstance. You have to give them the tools as early as possible, because it's not like the Russians don't know the Ukrainians are asking for these weapons. It's not like the Russians are not preparing for these weapons to come. It's not like the Russians aren't trying to think of some scenario what to do when they eventually get the ATACMS or when more Western tanks get shipped over. Wasn't an Abrams captured on footage a couple days ago finally? I hadn't heard that, but if you have evidence of that, I'd like to see it. Point is, this isn't the end, but it certainly was not the counteroffensive that we all wanted. Did it wear down Russian positions? Yes. Is the media going to talk about that? No. Did it take out a lot of Russians? Yes. Is the media going to talk about that? No. Did it really tear down a lot of Russia's counter battery fire? Yes. And that's one of the most significant things that are not being talked about. Is the media going to talk about it? No. All that's going to be talked about at the end of the day is what villages were captured. When you talk about the Kharkiv counteroffensive, very little time is ever concentrated on, wow, did you see the Ukrainians captured this much equipment from the Russians? Because they captured a ton of equipment from the Russians. In fact, when you look at amount of tanks that the Ukrainians have captured, a lot of it is just from that Kharkiv counteroffensive. But no one ever talks about that. All anyone talks about when they talk about the Kharkiv counteroffensive after the fact is how the map changed. And that's probably going to be the case in the United States politically afterwards. We're going to see probably people like Vivek Ramaswamy. We're going to see people like possibly maybe Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, and a whole host of other people, RFK, saying, look, this shows that the cause of Ukrainian liberation is fruitless. The Ukrainians are either unwilling to listen to the brilliance of U.S. command, which, of course, I disagree with that framing, but it could be something like that, or they're fighting against a Russia that's too mighty. This was always a fool's errand. We should quit right now. Abandon Ukraine. Well, that's Vivek's position. Vivek's position is abandon Ukraine. Trump's position is possibly abandon Ukraine. I guess it'll depend on his mood. And that is something that's going to be affected by the fact that this counteroffensive did not cut off the Russian land bridge. It's crazy how quickly this war has transformed from, oh my God, the Ukrainian miracle. They have done the impossible and stopped the Russian army, to, man, the Ukrainians weren't able to conduct a counteroffensive through some of the most highly mined territory, if not the most highly mined territory in the world, without air superiority. Pfft, man, pathetic, man. I can't believe they couldn't do that. Oof, can't believe it. Impossible. They can't win now. But yeah, obviously I'm disappointed. It could still turn around. There could still be a moment that it changes, But I saw some people completely disregarding this US Intel report. And while I disagree with some of the framing in the US Intel report and the fact that they're not going to take, I think, enough accountability about the mistakes they made in dragging their feet, but I don't believe that the general assessment of the fact that the counteroffensive has not been as successful as the Ukrainians wanted and has not achieved what they wanted, I don't believe that assessment is incorrect. And I believe we need to be honest about, what happens or what's happening on the front line if we want to properly cover the events, which I think is important for journalism, but also if we want to do what's necessary or address the problems that need to be addressed in order for Ukraine to do better.